Hey gang, Uncle Josh here. A couple of items we need to get to before we go on to the stories. The first of which is the winner of the $20 Amazon gift card. Only a couple of people guessed correctly, which I thought was interesting, and I'll talk about that in a second, but without any further ado, Fair Young is the winner of the contest. The names of the people who guessed correctly were put into a magic hat, and that was the name that was pulled out. So congratulations, Fair Young. And be sure to email me at unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com and we'll get you fixed up with that card. My story was The House in the Country, and I actually tamed it down a lot. A lot of other really weird shit happened there, but that's for another time. I was intrigued that a lot of you picked the same stories, though. The boys in the back room and the alien one. I thought that was interesting. Okay, I know a lot of you listen to the big guys, as do I, and a lot of them have been talking about how YouTube is making it harder for them to make money. I want to make it clear, this channel is not necessarily designed to generate tons of cash because I don't use AdSense for a reason. As much as I would like to make a couple of bucks off of ads, I can't stand it when videos are interrupted with a fucking Mobile Strike commercial, and I'm sure you feel the same way. Honestly, that's why I use YouTube Red. If you can afford it, I would suggest you do it. It makes life a hell of a lot nicer when you're cruising around looking for videos on YouTube. However, having said that, I am setting up a Patreon account. And if you are so inclined to throw a couple of bucks, that would be greatly appreciated. 100% clear. There is no obligation to do that, and I'm not going to beg anybody for money. But it does help, and will also help me be able to do more contests like the one we just did for the Amazon gift card. Truth be told, this wasn't even my idea. Someone in the comments and some people who have emailed me actually brought it up and said I should do it, and hey, what the hell, we'll give it a shot. Anyone who chooses to become a patron of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories will have access to exclusive content not available to anyone else, and at higher levels, some cool merchandise. Hey, consider it, but again, it's only a perk and not necessary to hear cool, scary stuff. I'm going to shut up. I would like to introduce a very talented person and thank her for helping out with this volume. Please welcome Mahala, and I guarantee you will be hearing her voice again in the future of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. So everybody, sit back and enjoy.
The stories you are about to hear are true. Some names and locations have been changed at the author's discretion. Welcome to Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories.
A haunting in New England. Between the ages of 10 and 14, I was terrified of my own house. A place that should have been comforting and an escape was full of fear and panic, and I did all I could do to stay out of it. I begged my parents to believe me, and believe what I saw and heard on a daily basis, but they wouldn't. It wasn't until I left the house for good that I was finally free. In the spring of 2002, my mother and her new husband purchased a home in New Milford, Connecticut. It was an older, remodeled home from the early 1900s. It stood on top of a hill. Its bright yellow color was inviting, and the two trees in the front yard were perfect for climbing. The inside was just as beautiful as the outside, but it did need work. Some worn-out wood floors ran throughout, and many of the house's original features stayed intact, including cubbyholes, a separate, smaller in-law apartment, old skeleton key locks, and loud copper pipes in the basement. That stuff would have to be remodeled or replaced. But the house was our new home, and we couldn't have been happier together. My parents planned out renovations for the house, and we settled into our new life. My sister and I were thrilled to not have to share a room anymore. In retrospect, I would have rather slept with her than alone. My first experience with the paranormal happened when I was 10. I was sitting in the bathtub after a particularly hard struggle with my homework. As I was sitting there relaxing, I watched in shock as a smoky black hand reached into the front of the tub and tried to turn the water off. I screamed, and in an instant it was gone. My mother came running in a panic, and I tried to tell her what I had seen. I knew she believed me, but On the surface, she denied it, suggesting that maybe I was tired and should just get some sleep. A few weeks passed without incident, and I shrugged off the shower incident and blamed it on sleep deprivation. However, another horrifying incident would change my mind. As my parents were renovating the house, they worked from the bottom floor up to the second floor where my bedroom was. I was used to repairmen walking up and down the steps day and night. One afternoon, as I played in my room alone, I heard heavy footsteps rush up the stairs, but they stopped about halfway there. Curious as to what the repairman was doing, I looked out of the room, but nobody was on the stairs. And I hadn't heard footsteps go back down, so someone had to be there, right? I turned back into my room, and in the corner was a black shadow standing nearly 6 feet tall. The shadow was shaped like a person. I could see a head and shoulder outline. Its long arms were by its side, and I could see my yellow wallpaper between the spaces of its fingers. The entire shadow was opaque and loomed, but I didn't stay to see if it would move. I ran down the stairs and outside onto the porch. I sobbed and rambled through what I had seen, and my mom finally told me that she believed me. She had seen this shadow figure too. She'd admitted she'd seen and even heard things in the house, but didn't want to tell me or my sister so we wouldn't be afraid. That night, as we all huddled in the living room to sleep, my parents discussed what we should do next. My stepdad was unwilling to believe that there was an entity in the house, but he agreed to get the house blessed by a priest. The four of us were raised Catholic, so placing our faith in God was the only rational solution. My sister and I didn't attend the blessing of our house, but when we returned afterwards, I knew it hadn't gone well. My parents weren't speaking, and the energy was just as dark in the house as before we left. The priest suggested we finish off the renovations as quickly as we could. He thought that while things were torn up, the more agitated whatever was in the house would become, and as he put it, the occurrences could become more dangerous. After my parents painted the last wall of our spare room, I remember taking a deep, relaxing breath. I was hopeful that our old house would calm down. However, I still was woken up by cold breezes and unexplained noises for years. I tried to tell myself I could ignore it, that the shadow creature would become bored and just leave. But from the moment I woke up in the morning until I went to bed, I felt like I was being watched and followed. On more than one occasion, I would hear my mother calling my name, and I knew that she wasn't home. The first few times were terrifying. How smart was this thing that could replicate my mother's voice? When I was 14, I decided it was time to take care of the entity myself. I researched methods of expelling this sort of thing, and even though I was terrified of what would happen, I needed to live in peace. Following the directions carefully, I opened all the windows and doors in the house. I burned sage throughout the entire place and told the entity that it didn't belong and it needed to leave. During the cleansing, the house creaked, and it felt as if the floors were vibrating under my feet. As I entered the last room, my bedroom, I felt a pressure on my head and back, almost as if something was pushing me. I kept repeating, "You need to leave. This is our house." For a few months after my cleansing, the house was calmer, and I felt a sense of relief. But the stress of the house had gotten in between my parents' marriage. My freshman year of high school came with a change. My parents were separating, and my mother, my sister, and I were moving out. As we were hastily packing, our elderly neighbor came over to say her goodbyes. My mother explained that she and my stepdad just couldn't work things out, and that it was time that they took some time apart. I will always remember what our neighbor said next. Now that I think about it, since I've lived here, all the couples that have lived in this house have gotten a divorce. Our neighbor shrugged it off as a coincidence, but I knew it wasn't. Whatever it was in there had been terrorizing my family, and it had been around for a long time, and my family wasn't its first victim. Moving to a new home was just as freeing as I imagined. I lived a less paranoid life, and I didn't feel so trapped. However, I know that the 4 years I lived in constant fear have affected me, and I will always be more prepared in the future if I ever have to face something like this again. Mrs. P. Submitted by Andy, 1062. This happened to my friend Carl when we were about 12 years old. We lived in the suburbs in a town in upstate New York outside of Albany. I want to say it was around 1984 or 5, but it's been a while. His real name isn't Carl, but it will be for this story. I guess I should tell a little bit about how we met. It was through church. Carl's family had moved to our town when we were both about 6, and they started going to our church that summer, and we met at summer Bible camp. I hated summer Bible camp, but that's neither here nor there, I guess. He didn't like it either, and that's probably how we became friends. When school started, we were in the same class, and we're both kind of rambunctious kids, always screwing around and not paying attention. This behavior basically stayed the same at church and church functions, but was worse there because the stakes weren't as high as getting in trouble at school. What was the worst those people were going to do, right? Well, we grew up together with our other good friends, getting into adventures, which meant going into abandoned buildings, exploring the dump at the edge of town, and climbing the forbidden water tower to spray paint crap on the side of it. Honestly, climbing that rickety ladder is a scary story in and of itself. Well, there were 4 of us: Jeremy, Chris, me, and Carl. We would ride our bikes everywhere, played Little League Baseball, and were really inseparable. One day, after hanging out in a local park, just riding our bikes around and goofing off, we all realized we needed to get home for dinner. Some pals from a few neighborhoods over were coming over that night to play Capture the Flag. We wanted to go in and eat and get back outside for the game. Jeremy and Chris lived about 4 streets away from my house, so they kept riding straight, while Carl and I turned down my street to get home. Carl lived another block down from me, so when I pulled into my driveway, he kept going too. As I threw my bike down on the front lawn, I looked up the street and saw Carl talking to a woman that went to our church. Well, let's call her Mrs. P. She was standing by her white van. No, not a free candy van, but one of those old Astro vans. I didn't think much of it as we knew who she was, so I hopped up the front steps and went inside to have dinner. After dinner, the phone rang and my mom answered it, spoke for a few minutes. She then leaned into the dining room from the kitchen and asked me if I had seen Carl. I said, yeah, he was talking to Mrs. P the last time I saw him. Mrs. P was a member of our church and was very active in kids stuff since her only child had passed away from a disease. I don't remember what it was. So she did Sunday school, the youth choir, a youth program like CYO, you name it. We always thought she was a little weird, but she wasn't too bad. She just seemed odd. My mom kept talking to Carl's mom, and then she hung up the phone. She came and asked me where they were when I saw them, and I told her. She looked worried, but didn't say anything, and I went to watch TV before going to play the game. We did play the game, but Carl never showed up. Even though I went to his house, no one answered the door when I knocked. I found out later the next day Carl wasn't at home, and he was missing. Carl's mom had called the police, and they were looking for him. I'll tell you right now, they did find Carl, but I didn't know the story until I was older, when he told me what happened. I guess his mom told him to never speak about it or something. What happened was that Mrs. P stopped him to ask him about something. He doesn't remember what it was exactly, but he does remember her asking him to help her with something at her house. Like I said, her kid was gone and she had divorced her husband a long time ago, so she lived alone. Anyway, Carl, I guess, felt he could trust her or something and said okay. So he put his bike in her van and they drove off. Well, when they got to her house, she brought him down to the cellar and then grabbed him and started trying to tie him up. He obviously realized something was wrong and started screaming, so she slapped him and then hit him on the head with something. Carl said it felt like he was underwater and couldn't move very well, and Mrs. P took advantage of that and tied him to a chair and then wrapped tape around his head and over his mouth. Then she pulled the chair into this room with a door and turned on cartoons on a TV. She left and closed the door, leaving Carl there. Jump back to the neighborhood and people looking for Carl. My mom had told Carl's mom and the police that I had saw him with Mrs. P, but that couldn't be related because she was just a nice lady from our church. The cops weren't about to pass up on any leads, so they drove over to Mrs. P's house. When they knocked on the door, she answered it, and they began the routine of asking her what happened when she talked to Carl, and she said that had never happened. The cops then told her there were witnesses that saw her, and she started to backpedal. The two cops asked if they could come in, and she let them. I guess one of them heard the cartoons going from the basement and asked her if she liked cartoons, and she said something like she didn't know what they were talking about. And I guess at that point they figured something was up. I mean, an older woman watching cartoons in the basement seemed a little weird. They asked her if they could check out where the TV was, and she got defensive and said no. One cop explained to her that a child was missing, was last seen with her, and she could either let them check it out or they'd get a warrant. She told him to leave, and they threatened her again, but she didn't care. The way Carl tells it, he could hear her start screaming at them to get out. They left, and did get a warrant and went back. They found her packing suitcases of clothes, not only for her, but young Boyd's clothes too. They found Carl in the basement. He was crying and struggling and had shit and pissed his pants. Man, I don't blame him. All the time the cops were in the basement, a bunch of other cops were upstairs trying to subdue a crazy Mrs. P, who was flailing around the room with a knife, talking about it was God's will that brought Carl to her, and she was taking him far away to be her son, and if they didn't let her, she was going to kill him. Anyway, this is really long, so I'll wrap it up. They got Carl home, and I didn't see him for a while. He never came out of his house and never wanted anyone to come over and play. Later, he told me he didn't want to because he felt embarrassed and stupid for what had happened. We never thought that about him at all. Carl got back to a normal life after a bit, and I guess Mrs. P was arrested, convicted of a bunch of stuff, and ended up in a mental hospital. The police found all these notebooks in her house with journal entries talking about her dead daughter and how God was going to replace her with another kid and shit like that. I know this might not sound scary to a lot of people, but it was for me, and it sure was for Carl. We always thought Mrs. P was weird, but now we know that bitch was downright crazy. The Blue Indian, submitted by Anonymous. This is true, and it happened to me about 16 years ago. I very rarely speak of it, and I don't even think my wife knows about it. I would appreciate it if I could remain anonymous. I grew up in San Diego, California, and lived on a ranch from the time I was 3 until my early 20s. I've seen many things, and I generally don't talk about them because of how strange even I think they are. But I have one story that I remember very clearly, and I want to share it with you. I was in high school at the time, and just so you know, I've never been into drugs, and I didn't even start drinking until after high school. My experiences happened cold, sober. One winter night it was windy and generally cold. For those of you not familiar with San Diego, cold was probably in the 50s. I was the only person home, and I had stayed up watching movies, eventually getting bored and deciding to get ready to go to bed. As I was walking from the bathroom to my room, I noticed all the downstairs lights were on, including the outside lights, and the light in our pool. I did think this was odd, but I didn't think twice to go and shut them off. I went downstairs and turned off the house alarm. I had to do that to go outside and shut off the light for the pool and the driveway lights. I re-entered the house, rearmed the alarm system, and turned off all the lights again. And then I went upstairs to go to bed. I turned off my light in my room, and as I did, the driveway lights outside turned on again. This not being the first weird thing to ever happen to me, I said aloud, "Man, this is bullshit." I went downstairs in the dark, and as I stepped off the stairs, the kitchen light turned on. I turned off the alarm again and went outside to shut off the driveway lights. As I shut the switch off, I yelled out, "Don't do it again!" I went back inside, rearmed the system once again, and then went to the kitchen where those lights were on. I shut them off and made sure nobody was home. Of course, nobody was, so I went back to my room. Back in my room, and the house now in total darkness, I was standing in my doorway, making sure the lights were really off this time. I shut my door and got in bed. As I grabbed the blankets, I noticed the hall light was now on. I could see the light coming from underneath my door. I didn't think that this was too much of a burden because the switch was just outside my room and maybe I forgot to turn him off. I was kneeling on the end of my bed and I opened my door. I leaned around the corner and flipped the switch off. As I did, there was a light from the top of the stairs. The light was bluish in color and not overwhelmingly bright. Down the hall, maybe 8 to 10 feet from me, was an American Indian, standing there in full dress, looking very tall and very proud. The bluish light was coming from a weird fog that was surrounding him. His arms were crossed and one fist was clenched and the other had a hatchet. I couldn't see through him. It was like he was really there. I shut my door, waited a few minutes, probably more like a lot of minutes. The point is I went back out there. I rechecked every closet, looked under every bed, went into all the bathrooms, and nobody was in that house except me. Still, to this day, I can remember the details of that Indian. The house was cheap for a reason. Back in 1985, my family moved to a small town in Ohio. I was 10 at the time. My parents had bought a large 5,000 square foot split-level house that was built in the late 50s. It had everything my parents could have imagined. 7 bedrooms, 5.5 baths, a game room, tons of closets, and even an indoor swimming pool. Even before they bought the house, they were wondering why the house was so cheap. I mean, it was in perfect condition, and only on the market for 1/3 of its appraisal value. But the inspections all came back with flying colors, not an ant or a rotten board in the house. Without a second thought, they bought it. Things were great for about the first year and a half, but then things started to happen. Little stuff at first. Doors slamming, lights turning themselves on and off, TV sets going blank for a few seconds then coming back on with no one touching them. It was also about this time that my mom started to have a scary reoccurring dream about a man watching her. It was our second year in the house, and the strange happenings were about to take a frightful turn. I remember it was July 4th, and my mom was alone in the bar room located on the lower level. She was cleaning the mirrors that covered the entire room, when all of a sudden my mother let out a scream that I will never forget. I can still hear it in my memory to this day. My sister and I were at the dining room table when we heard her scream, and being 12 and 8 at the time, we were horrified and ran to her. I came to the locked bar room doors and could hear my mother crying on the other side. My heart was pounding, and I was crying as I screamed for her to let me in. She quickly opened the door, fell to the floor, and hugged us, and we were all crying, and I didn't even know why. My mother was still very shaken, but she took us outside to our gazebo and told us everything would be okay. At that point, I was still confused and wondering what had happened, but she wouldn't say. A few hours later, my father and my 3 brothers came home from a July 4th ball game at the park. Without seeing my mother or that she was shaken up, he just said, "Hey, you guys ready to see some fireworks?" Then Mom ran up to him and started crying just like she had earlier. Finally, we got to hear what had happened. She just said, Ira, I saw it, oh my God, I saw it, Ira, I saw it." My dad asked her, "What? You saw what?" My mother replied, "Something, someone, I don't know, but I know it's evil. I just know it is." Later, I would learn that while she was cleaning the mirrors, she had seen someone looking back at her, and then it started to smile, and it just kept smiling until an evil, almost laughing, devilish face appeared in the mirror, looking right at her. 3 weeks would pass before my mom would go back into the house. She and my younger sister had been staying at my grandparents' place. I felt safe in the house because I slept on the floor of my oldest brother's room. David was 19 and out of school, and he looked out for me and made me feel very secure. I did feel a lot better, though, when my mom and sister came home again. There's a lot of other things that were really scary that happened between the time that I talked about and what I'm about to tell you now. but in order to fit this into a reasonable amount of room, I'm going to move ahead a few years. Over the next 2 years, there would be many more horrible and frightening experiences for the family. By this time, my grandparents had moved in with us, and things finally started to calm down when the biggest tragedy of my life occurred. My big brother David drowned in our swimming pool. He was only 22. The whole family was devastated. His death would be followed by the death of all of the family pets over the next 3 months. And then all of this would be followed by the death of my grandmother, who died late one October night. She had been ill for a long time, and doctors didn't give much hope, so we were kind of expecting it. But as she lay there dying with the whole family around her, she said, "David is here for me. David is here for me." She went on, and it was so moving. And all I know, while the house was pure evil, that day no evil could destroy our love. After Grandma's death, the disturbances picked up once again, and finally, after years of just letting it happen, my mother and father started to research the house. They questioned the neighbors, but being so far from them, they knew little or nothing about its history, except that the house had had 12 owners before my parents, and this they found both strange and alarming. They went to the library and got all the information and documents they could, but they had nothing on them. Then one day, by accident, my mom literally ran into a woman who used to live in the house across the street back in the 50s. She told my mother a story about the original owner and builder of the house. She said that he, the first owner, was looking for an inexpensive way to build a large house. The cheapest method he could come up with was to employ cheap labor, in this case, illegal immigrants. Well, construction was going fine until local authorities got word of this from the building inspectors. Getting word of it in a panic, he rushed to get rid of them, and in the process, one of the men was somehow killed. The body is believed to be buried somewhere on the property. My parents were somewhat skeptical of this story, and then went back to the library and also the Hall of Records and looked through papers. Sure enough, the first owner of the house had been arrested. I don't know what the charge was, but there was no mention of a worker who had died there. Finally, in 1997, my parents sold the house to a company who was going to build a mini-mall on the site. Not more than 2 months after it was sold, they started to raise the house, and a horrible discovery was made. The body of a man was found within a small hidden area of the basement. In fact, the original plans show the space as a closet. We just never found it. But that's not all that was found. Near the garage, they found 2 more bodies that were later identified as men in their mid to late 30s, each with a silver cross worn across their neck. The case is still under investigation as far as I know, but police have little to go on since little is known about the original owner, who, if still alive, would probably be around 95 years old. A creepy ending for us, for a creepy house. Stalked. This happened on the north slope of Divide Ridge, south of Rimrock Lake in Yakima County, Washington. I'll begin by saying that I'm an avid extreme hunter and outdoorsman, as is my companion on this trip that I'll tell you about. We have hunted together for many years through all sorts of terrain and conditions, and have developed a certain uncanny sense for each other in the mountains. Normally I would not entertain writing this, but I have again been awakened by reoccurring dreams and nightmares of this misadventure. The incident began after some brutal, unsuccessful elk hunting on Bethel Ridge above Oak Creek. We were both local and knew the mountain better than most, decided to head over to Cowich, where I had tagged a nice young bull the year before. The area supports a fair local herd and is extremely rugged. We had access to an area through a friend that owned some property and lived a very primitive lifestyle up there. I'll call him Frank, and he was a little bit eccentric. His tales of Bigfoot and always telling people to not be caught on Divide Ridge after dark were scoffed at by people like myself and my hunting partner I'll call Justin. Anyway, we headed straight up the ridge in my hunting rig late in the afternoon to pitch camp. We encountered 3 other rigs coming back down as the sun was setting. They were driving at a high rate of speed. I knew one of the guys. He's a logger up there, and he stopped to warn us of the Divide Ridge after dark thing again. I said, "Yeah, thanks. See ya." And he went on his way back down the mountain, again, moving pretty fast. Justin thought they were just being a bunch of pussies. We found a fair site to spend the night. As some weather was coming in, we picked the heavily wooded, very dense north slope to put our bedrolls out. For whatever reason, this night the place had an eerie feel to it, but I just dismissed it as being something stuck in my head. We were gathering wood by flashlight for a fire when we both stopped and simultaneously looked at each other. "You smell that?" I asked. "Yeah," replied Justin. "It's probably just a cougar kill." A very strong, rancid odor, not like rotting meat decay, just a putrid smell wafted through the air. We got a fire going, and I put on a big pot of venison chili. And Justin started building the fire bigger and bigger, and this was uncommon for him. I asked him if he was okay, and he stated, "Something ain't right up here tonight." And I said, I kind of agree. We both know fear feeds on fear, so to keep calm, we just stopped talking about it. And then we heard the first whistle and howl. The first one was distant, and we could hear clearly due to no wind in the cold. When elk call each other, people not familiar with Wapiti can misinterpret these calls as whistles. This was no elk. Justin got out his elk call and responded with a short set of chirps. I got out my Weatherby and my .44 Magnum. Again, something was not right. There was no initial response to Justin's cow calls. I put some more wood on the fire. And then came the second shrill howl, in the creek bottom right below us. It was loud and like nothing else we had ever heard, and believe me when I tell you we have hunted every manner of known species in these mountains, I have never heard anything like that. My hair was literally standing on end. Justin said, "We're out of here right now. Cover me. I'm striking camp." He started packing up our tarps and gear while I sat listening and watching, heavily armed. Justin is one of the most fearless men I have ever met, but right now he was white with fear. Next thing we heard were feet walking in the snow, very loud crunching. Justin just about knocked me over getting to my rifle. The scary part is, we have crashed enough hooved ungulates through the woods to know the sound of 4 legs crunching snow. This was not 4 legs, and it was very deliberate walking, not crashing or running. I yelled out that we were locked and loaded, and whoever was out there to come into the light, hoping someone would. The crunching snow stopped. Now, both Justin and I are very seasoned and responsible hunters, and probably the last ones to shoot at noises in the dark, but this had gone far beyond where we had ever been. There was something standing out there in the dark, large and not afraid of us, which for any manner of known species in our mountains is unusual. This silent standoff went on for about 2 minutes. We could see nothing outside the light of the fire in our lanterns. Mind you, this creature was close enough that we could hear it walking in the snow, so we knew it was still there, but the smell was gone. I called out one more time, and we fired 1 shot from my pistol into the air. Then all hell broke loose. There was a loud, short grunt and running feet crunching in the snow, and we started firing, reloading and firing. We didn't stop shooting until we were close to running out of ammo. After a harrowing drive down the mountain at night in the snow, which I don't recommend to anybody, even experienced drivers, we made it back to the ranch. My wife took one look at us and knew something was wrong. Justin refused to talk the whole drive down the mountain, and to this day refuses to talk about it. I have no desire to go back up Divide Ridge to investigate. Right now it's 3 a.m., and I'm writing this after I was awakened again by the same dream. One thing is curious. Did the sound of my hunting buddy blowing the Wapiti cow call attract something? And why was it not afraid of human voices or the fire? It was obviously afraid of gunfire. Another thing I forgot to mention is the flashlights were in the truck outside of our fire lantern light when this occurred, and neither one of us thought about retrieving them to illuminate whatever was out there. I'm still an avid hunter, but now I stick to Bethel Ridge. Make no mistake, this incident has changed my perspective on a lot of things. I would encourage anyone interested in Sasquatch or Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it, spend some time up on Divide Ridge. The only thing I can tell you is, good luck. Real nightmares. For my whole life, the image of a severed hand has been a reoccurring figure in my occasional nightmares. When I do have a nightmare, I made a habit of just telling myself to wake up, and when fully awake, just checking to make sure everything was fine before going back to sleep. Stuff like turning on the light, turning it back off, looking under the bed, that sort of thing. Anything to put myself back at ease. I am the oldest of 5 children. On the day after I graduated from high school in 1980, my mother remarried, and she, my brother, and 3 sisters moved to Lewisville, Texas, to live with her new husband. One of my sisters, Melissa, was very excited to be getting her own room, after having shared a room with the other 2 girls her entire life. Not long afterward, I was talking to my mom on the phone, and she said something funny was happening. Many mornings she found Melissa sleeping in bed with one of my 2 sisters in their room. When I asked about it, Melissa would just say she had had a bad dream, but as time went on, it got to the point where Melissa refused to sleep in her own room. The following Christmas break from college, I went to stay with them. Mom said I could sleep in Melissa's room, since she never slept there anyway. It was a very small room, just big enough for a twin bed, a chest of drawers, and a small desk. On Christmas Eve, I stayed up very late wrapping some gifts and was the last one into bed. About 2 a.m. I turned in and quickly fell asleep. I began to have a terrible nightmare. In it, there was a severed hand, as I mentioned before, but this time, for some reason, its image was very clear. Cold, dead, but somehow malevolent, and it was trying to strangle me. In the dream, I put my pillow over it to try to hold it down, but it was struggling to get out. I told myself to wake up, that I was just having a bad dream, and I did wake up. I sat up in bed, really surprised at how vivid the dream had been. But I did calm down quickly. I lay back down to go to sleep, and as I always did, to prove to myself there was nothing there, I stuck my hand under the pillow and grabbed a cold, dead hand that squeezed my hand back very hard. I screamed. The kind of scream that you can only make when you are gripped by utter terror, because if you tried to do it consciously, you'd hurt your vocal cords. In seconds, the entire family was at the door. When the light snapped on, I was recoiling back from the pillow in total panic, and told them all that there was a hand under the pillow. I yanked the pillow up, and there was nothing there. I quickly regained my composure and told everyone to go back to bed. After about 10 minutes, fell asleep again, and slept uneventfully for the rest of the night. The next afternoon, after all the holiday festivities had died down, Melissa asked to speak to me outside alone. She looked me square in the eye and said, "There was a hand under your pillow last night. There is something in that room that knows what you're afraid of, and oftentimes it shows it to you." She then told me she started having bad nightmares shortly after having moved into the room. Melissa had always been afraid of something being under the bed, and several nights said she'd heard something scrabbling around under it, or clawing at the bottom of her bed. She'd get up and turn on the light, and of course nothing was there. Then, one night, she heard the scrabbling, and she said out loud, "I am tired of this. I am not going to get up and look under the bed this time." Suddenly, without warning, something yanked all the covers off of her and pulled them under the bed. Melissa stood up on the bed and jumped from it to the doorway and ran to her sister's room. She never slept in that room again. She said it was okay during the daytime and would dress there, do her homework, and that sort of thing. But every night, she would just lay in bed until everyone else got into bed and fell asleep, and then she would creep to her sister's room and fall asleep there. She would try and wake up before everyone else in the morning and go back to her room, but didn't always succeed, and that's how my mother found her in there in the first place. We never did know exactly what it was. Poltergeist, ghost, who knows? I have no idea whatever it was. I do have first-hand experience knowing that it certainly enjoyed scaring the shit out of you. Ashley by Semper Fi Todd. Special guest, Mahala, as the voice of Ashley. I want to start out by letting you know that I'm a former Marine. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan before deciding I wanted to have a civilian life. It's not that I didn't like what I did, but I had done and seen enough that it was time for me to move on. Sadly, I still have issues with a lot of the stuff I experienced, and I'm now dealing with PTSD. Don't get me wrong, I get along okay, but there are times that it's really hard. I've got a great support system, but this story is about someone who was there for me until things went south. I'm originally from Texas, a little town near a lake that the Colorado River runs through. When I got out of the service, I went back home to my girl who patiently waited for me. I got a job at my best friend's fishing guide service and shop, and I also tended bar on the weekends at a local joint. My girl Ashley was finishing college and worked as a secretary at a law firm. We'd been dating since middle school, and she was everything I wanted. Brains, blonde, boobs and butt, and man, downright beautiful. Ashe was a real cowgirl. She liked to camp and fish and hunt, the things that I liked. She wasn't a buckle bunny like all the girls she grew up with and was friends with. I was so in love with her, and was so happy to be back with her when I got home. As I mentioned, I suffer from PTSD, and sometimes I'm sure it makes me hard to live with. I don't go all gonzo or anything, but I sometimes withdraw from people, and I'm sure it's hard for those around me to understand that I'm not pushing them away. I just kind of need to be by myself to work through things sometimes. I'm not sure if that added to what was to come. After I'd been back stateside for a year, things were going pretty well. I was having less and less panic attacks and getting used to civilian life. Work was good, and I was getting ready to propose to Ashe. It was exciting. It felt like I was on top of the world, and then things changed. Ashe became, I don't know how to say it, just different. She became extremely possessive of me, to the point that it started to interfere with my work. She would constantly call me at the pro shop to check up on me. Once in a while, she would hang out with her friends at the bar I worked at, but on other nights, she would show up and yell at me that I was paying more attention to other women. Mind you, these other women were just people at the bar. One Saturday night after work, I drove home and quietly went inside our place. It was late, and I didn't want to wake Ashe. I just wanted to grab a shower and get into bed with her and Spoon before falling asleep. I got out of the bathroom, dried off, and Ashe was standing at the front of our bed.
Where were you?
"Oh, hey, sweetie, I'm sorry for waking you up," I whispered. Walking towards her, I attempted to give her a hug. She stood stone solid with a look of anger on her face.
What's her name?
"What's whose name? What are you talking about, sugar? I just got out of work."
The bitch, the one with the spandex. I know she was there tonight. I saw her.
"Ashe, what are you talking about? When were you there? Why didn't you even say hi?"
Don't play stupid, Todd. She practically had her tits in your face.
This had not happened. Number one, I don't let people get near me except my close friends, another side effect of the PTSD. And number two, there was a woman in the bar dressed on the skanky side, but I never served her. My coworker Angela took care of her and her friends all night. "Sweetie, I don't know what you're talking about. No woman was anywhere near me tonight, and even if someone did get close to me, you know that I'd push them away." Ashe started to vibrate. She was getting so worked up.
Don't know why I'm not good enough for you.
I reached for her, but she recoiled and began crying and screaming about stuff that had never happened. Finally, she sat down on the bed, and I was able to calm her down. Putting an arm around her, I told her that nothing like what she was saying had ever happened, and that I loved her, and only her. She sobbed a little more, but finally eased up, and I helped her get back into bed and then turned off the bathroom light. Ashe was already fading by the time I snuggled in next to her. The next day, it was like nothing had ever happened. She didn't mention anything, and I didn't bring up what had happened. We woke up, had breakfast, and then walked down to the lake that was just down the street from where we lived. I chalked it up as just a bad night, and that was that. Sadly, I wouldn't have sent you this story if that was all there was to this. Ashe started to become more like the way she was that night. Always on edge, always calling me, never believing me about where I was and who I was with. One time my friend and employer asked me to stay late to prep a boat for the next day. Some bigwigs were coming in early for a fishing trip, and he wanted to make sure everything was ready. Not a problem on my end. Until I went home.
Where the fuck were you?
"Hey, had to work late, sugar. I texted you around 3 when Ray asked me to stay late."
I'm getting tired of this bullshit, Todd. If you don't want me, go find someone else to sleep with.
What the fuck is your problem? I had to work late, that's it. Jesus, you're fucking crazy. I left the room to go wash up, and something smashed into the wall in front of me. Ashe had thrown a glass at me but missed. And I'm not kidding. She whipped a glass at the back of my head. Thank God it did miss. I slowly turned around and looked at her, and then just walked out the door. She followed me, screaming.
That's right. Get the fuck out of here, you loser. Go run off to your whores.
I didn't even turn back, and she just kept raving. I got into my truck and just started driving around the lake. It's not a huge lake, but I was driving slow and just wanted to take stock of the whole situation. I didn't know what the hell was wrong with her. My phone was blowing up the entire time I was out, but I didn't answer it. After a couple of hours, I went home. Ashe had been crying, but she had also been very busy. She had smashed a ton of our dishes and even broke some windows and a door. Her hands and feet were bloody from handling broken glass and china. She had written "fuck you" on my face of a picture that was hanging of the both of us on our wall, and she had written "I'm going to kill myself" on a little dry erase board on her refrigerator. She started begging for my forgiveness, saying she was sorry and that she just needed me. I didn't want to, but I caved. I held her and she calmed down. She was just so beautiful, and I had trusted her for so long. I couldn't stay mad at her. But, like before, things really got out of hand. She started harassing people I worked with. I had no idea what was going on at the time, but she was threatening my female coworkers, both at the marina and at the bar. I went to work on a Friday night, and Angela told me I had better put Ashe on a leash, and if she ever came into the bar again, she would mess her up. Angela was not a woman to mess with. She carried a stiletto knife, and I saw her put it into action more than once. I talked to Ashe about it later, and she said that she had no idea what Angela was talking about. The next night, the tires on Angela's Jeep were slashed while we were working, and her windshield was smashed in. A woman I worked with at the marina shop, who was nearly my mother's age, had her car vandalized. Someone had thrown dead birds and fish all over the front and back seats, and even a young girl who only worked once in a while had stuff happen to her. Someone ran over her bike and wrote "worthless bitch" in lipstick on her book bag. I couldn't say it was Ashe who was responsible, but deep down I thought she had something to do with it. Things were getting scarier. There were days that my truck keys would disappear, only to reappear after an event I was supposed to go had passed, like golfing with my buddies or fishing trips. Again, I thought it was her, but couldn't prove it. One time I went golfing with her dad, uncle, and brother, and while we were in the middle of our game, I looked up to see Ashe storming across the course with a ranger right behind her. She started yelling at me about lying to her, who I was with, and what I was doing, despite the fact that we were standing on a golf course and her family was with me.
If you don't love me, just say so and leave me.
She screamed and then turned around and ran by the ranger. Everyone stood staring at me. I just shrugged my shoulders. They knew something was up. Lots of other things happened, too. Anytime I tried to talk to my counselor or people I knew were also suffering from PTSD, she would get in the way, intervening, saying,
"Why do you need to go to these meetings? I guess I'm not fucking good enough for you."
Finally, one day my boss sent me home from work early. I thought, great, I can get some things done around the house, take a nap, maybe do something fun with Ashe, make some dinner early. It looked like it was going to be a great day. While I was puttering around the yard, Ashe's mom pulled up and looked at me strangely. "Hey, what brings you out here today?" I said, smiling. She stammered a response that didn't make sense and then asked what I was doing home. I told her I had time off and was just getting some things done and was ready to make lunch. I invited her to stay, and she reluctantly did so. I made some sandwiches and had a beer. We chatted, and she started to get back to her normal self. She gave me a hug and left. Later, I would find out that Ashe told her I was cheating on her and asked my mom to check up on me. Realizing that that wasn't true, she stopped doing it. I mean, I didn't even know it, but she would drive my place of work to see if I was there and stuff. It was messed up. I didn't know it, but this evening was going to be a very tense night for me. I made good on my promise to take a nap and make dinner before Ashe got home from work. Well, not the dinner part. I did fall asleep and was just waking up on the couch when I felt something tapping on my head. I looked up to see Ashe standing next to the couch. "Hey, sugar," I said. Damn, I wanted to make dinner before you got home, but I must have slept too long. I yawned, and the tap on my head came again. It was then that I realized it was the barrel of my Kimber 45. I shuddered. I mean, literally shuddered. Ashe, baby, what are you doing?
I thought you loved me.
I do love you, sugar. Ashe, put the gun down. This is dangerous.
What is so wrong with me? Ever since you left for the Marines, I could tell you didn't want me anymore. What's wrong with me, Todd? Do you want to fuck other women, Todd? Is that it?
Ashe, none of that's true. Calm down and put the gun down, baby. She started to cry and her hand was shaking. I wasn't sure if the pistol was loaded, but if it was and the safety was off, I might be wearing my brains on the outside real soon. My Kimber had a very soft trigger pull, and inside I was terrified while trying to be cool outward. Ashe, put the gun down.
Goodbye, Todd,
she said. I thought, this is it, I'm dead. But she turned and ran into our bathroom. Before I could get up, I heard one shot. Ashley had shot herself in the chest in an attempt to kill herself, but thank God it didn't happen. She was half in the bathtub and bleeding badly. I screamed and called the paramedics, and soon our front yard was full of first responders. I got out of the way while they went to work on Ashe and wheeled her out on a stretcher. Yeah, the sheriffs had plenty of questions for me, but they knew the basics of what had happened, and it was clear that I hadn't done this to her. They drove me to the hospital not too far behind the ambulance, and I was frantically trying to call her parents at the same time. They met me at the hospital that was about 10 miles away, and after a couple of hours of surgery, Ashe was going to be okay. She was in critical condition, but she was going to live. Her parents were understandably inconsolable, but things started to calm down once we knew that she was all right. The doctors told us to get some sleep, and Ashe was going to be out for a while, so there was no need to stay at the ER. The sheriff said that they were going to have to do more stuff at our place as part of the investigation, and that I should stay some other place tonight. I asked if I could run in and grab some things out of the house, and they said that was okay as long as one of them was with me. Her parents wanted me to be with them that night, and I said I would be over to their place after I gathered some things. When I got home, the sheriff that was with me was a female. She was very nice. She knew I was shook up and tried to comfort me by talking about other things. I went inside and looked at the bloody bathroom and could still smell the smoke from my Kimber lingering in the air. I started to shake, and the sheriff told me to get some things and get out of the house quickly, just for my own sanity. I went into our bedroom and opened our closet to grab a gym bag and noticed something in the back under some random crap I had thrown in there. It was a box. I pulled it out and could not believe what I saw. It was a Ouija board. And inside the box on top of the Ouija board were notebooks. And notebooks with Ashe's handwriting. Hundreds of messages written down about how I was cheating on her and that I didn't love her. Even worse things that I don't even want to share here. Ashe had been talking to something or someone via the Ouija board for months and making records of the messages she was receiving, or maybe just making up in her head. I can't say which, but I tend to think it's the latter. Over time, she had convinced herself that I was going behind her back, and that's what all the outbursts were about. I never brought it up to Ashe, and I don't think I ever will. Today, she's doing a lot better. I wonder if my dealing with PTSD had anything to do with what happened. Like, my condition only amped up what she had been going through, or maybe she'd been dealing with it all her life. She's getting treatment, and so am I. We're slowly trying to put our lives back together, and I hope that we can get back what we once had. I know this story isn't as scary as some of the stories you do share, but I hope you'll narrate it. Mental illness can be scarier than any ghost or skinwalker. Fuck mental illness. And you know what? Fuck Ouija boards too. Demon Blanket. Submitted by Autumn H. It's been over 10 years, but I still remember this like it was yesterday. My birth mom, I was adopted shortly after this, would go out to party almost every night and leave me and my infant brother home alone. I was only 4. I remember waking up one night, and it was like the air in my room was too heavy for me to breathe. I looked around, and in one corner of my room, it was significantly darker than the rest. I realized I was looking down at the floor, so I started looking up and realized this shadow was as tall as my ceiling. It had red eyes, but not how people think they'd look. It was kind of like when you take a picture with the flash on and people's eyes have that weird reddish glow. Then this black blanket, I have no other word to describe it, wrapped itself around me. But instead of fear, I felt anger. I've never felt that much anger before or since, and I know I was a little kid, but I'm not kidding. I remember wanting to hurt my brother, kill my mom. After what seemed like forever, the blanket thing retracted, and the anger was replaced with terror. The last thing I remember was going into my brother's room, and he was screaming. I slept on his floor that night. The Red-Faced Monster. This happened 20 years ago when I was 9 years old. I lived in one of 4 trailers on a 4,000-acre farm in Florida. My father was the foreman and ran the whole thing. He could tell you where to plant, where to get the best yield, or which canal drained into what lake, and he was also responsible for hiring the mostly Hispanic migrant workers. One Saturday, I ended up having to babysit my brother Bobby, who was 4. We were all alone, and it was getting dark. I was in the living room watching a movie, and he was in our parents' room watching cartoons. I had spent most of the day entertaining him and just kind of wanted to be left alone until my parents came back with the rest of my siblings. I didn't realize for the last 10 minutes he had been sitting at my feet next to our couch. He was trembling. "What's the matter?" I asked. He didn't reply. "Come on, man, what's going on?" I kept prying, trying to figure out what the hell was wrong with him. He wouldn't budge until I threatened to put him back in my mom and dad's room alone. Then, with a slight stutter, he said, A monster with a red face was in the window." Shit, I could have burst out laughing if he didn't look so distraught. I told him I would go outside and look around, and then he latched onto my legs and shook his head no. So I said, "Okay, come with me, we're going to go check the windows from the inside." So I took him back to my parents' room, checked every window, and he was content. He wrapped himself in a blanket and went to sleep. I went back to my spot on the couch and resumed my movie. All was well until a deafening banging came to my front door. I mean, it was so loud it shook the window in the kitchen on the other side of the trailer. My heart sank, my eyes glued to the front door. I started whispering a prayer to God, "Please let this thing go away, but don't let it..." I could feel my heart trying to explode through my chest, and my ears started ringing. I ran into the kitchen searching for a weapon. Yeah, for a 9-year-old, I was pretty ballsy. I picked up a broom and quickly realized how stupid a broom would be against whatever was out there. So I ran to the opposite side of the trailer where I knew I had a shovel. A miniature one, but built just like its larger brother. Perfect for my hands, sturdy as hell. I had found my weapon. I checked all the doors and wasn't worried about the windows. If you haven't lived in a trailer, a quick tidbit, they are usually always about 3 to 4 feet off the ground for plumbing. Ours was a lot higher, maybe 5 or 6 feet because of flooding in Florida. The doors were locked, weapons secured. I slid to the same position Bobby had been sitting by the couch. I figured the closer to the floor I was, with the couch to my back, the safer I was. Minutes seemed like hours, but there was no more knocking, thank God. I started watching my movie again, but by this time the credits were rolling, and it was over, and the black screen with the tiny lettering made it annoyingly easy to see the reflection from lights outside. My hands tightened grip on the shovel so hard my forearms started trembling, because in the reflection of the TV, in the corner of the window behind the couch, 6 feet off the ground, was my little brother's red-faced monster looking inside the trailer. I didn't dare make a move, and how I didn't piss myself at that moment is beyond me. What the fuck was this thing? And why the hell on the only day that all my neighbors, only 3 of them, and my family left us alone, is this thing harassing or trying to kill us or eat us or whatever? I looked at the TV again, but whatever was in the window was gone. I crept my head a few inches over the sofa, just enough in time to see this thing that appeared to be wearing clothes on all fours, crawling into an irrigation ditch. It was heading away from us, so I breathed a sigh of relief. I was panicking, but started formulating a battle plan if this thing came back. I was also trying to figure out what the hell it was. It had pants and a long-sleeve shirt on. What looked like black hair filled with leaves and twigs, and it moved on all fours. I was actually praying for my parents to come home. I wasn't sure if this was really a monster or not. Then a knock at the door. This was more human, and not that terrifying. So I got my courage up and crept to the door and slowly looked out the window. There was the monster, standing upright but swaying like a snake from left to right. Its face was red, blood red. It was running from an extremely large laceration above his forehead. A portion of his scalp was actually hanging to the side. I opened the door, finally realizing it was not a monster. In Spanish, I asked the man what was wrong with him. He couldn't speak due to the fact that he was so inebriated, he just mouthed his response. I told him to wait right there. I put the shovel down and went to call 911. Then I grabbed an entire roll of paper towels and asked him to sit on our stairs. He did, and I wrapped the gaping wound as the best I could, but blood kept pouring out. Then I recognized who he was. It was a guy who worked for my dad. The reason I know this is because 2 days before, he was at my house having his hair permed by my mom. She was a hairstylist. The reason he came to our house tonight was because he was drunk as a skunk. I asked him what had happened, but I couldn't understand anything, and I finally told him that I was calling for help and that an ambulance should be on the way. Then he got annoyed and started yelling, Call him back, I'll fucking kill you, I'm gonna kill you! So I backed up and grabbed a shovel again. He grabbed the towels and the water that I brought him, and then just kind of took off into the woods. 5 minutes later, I could hear the sirens coming. The road that leads from the main farm road breaks off and comes down to our 4 trailers, but I heard the ambulance stop and then instead go straight, taking them farther down the road to a nearby packing factory. I called back and I told the operator that they were going in the wrong direction, so they sent a cop to my trailer. One of my dad's sub-foremen came over on his four-wheeler and asked which direction the man had went so he might help find him. I told him he had walked off into the woods and pointed in the general direction. My mom finally made it home as the cops were leaving my trailer. She went nuts, screaming at what the hell had happened and where was my brother. I thought she would have been proud of me having defended our home and dialed 911 to seek for help for the hurt man who was a friend of my dad's. Nope. Instead, I got bombarded by my mom, sister, and brother screaming that I should not have called 911 because it made the man take off into the woods, and that decision might mean he would die. Can you believe that shit? Putting that on a 9-year-old that just went through one of the most traumatic experiences of his life? Well, then I could hear my dad pull up, and I got really scared as he burst through the door and he looked at all of us. And I looked at my mother, brother, sister, and they all had that look. The look that we knew meant, who the fuck called the police? I thought, oh boy, I'm about to get my ass kicked. During all of this, they started yelling over each other, and my father finally asked everybody to be quiet, and got the story, and asked me what had happened too. He walked over to me, and looked at everybody in the eye. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, Muy bien, mijo. Good job, son. I'm very proud of you. That was the first time I had ever heard that from my father's mouth. What I didn't know, and my family didn't know either until later, was that the drunk friend was driving 3 other friends to pick up their last check, and he was so fucked up that he crashed into the factory concrete wall that I mentioned was down the road. They were all injured very badly. Well, after my dad had said what he said, I looked at my mom and siblings. My dad handed me 2 $10 bills and said I could use it to buy anything I wanted. Booyah, Mom. Hey everybody, and a happy Mother's Day to you if you are catching this on Sunday. I hope all the mothers out there are enjoying their special day and hope you are well as well. Thanks for listening to this volume of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. More to come shortly. And again, I know I talked about this at the beginning, but check out my Patreon page. If you're not into it, that's cool. If you are, that's even cooler. And again, if you like any of the music that you've heard, please check out the links to the people who have made that music possible in the description below, as well as links to my social media. I hope you will follow me there as well. You'll notice I've done a couple of different things with some of the stories, and I would love to hear if you like the idea of having sound effects in some of the stories, and if you like guest voices. And again, special thanks to Mahala for being part of this, and I'm pretty sure that she's going to be heard in following episodes of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. So, everybody, have a wonderful weekend, have a terrific week, and I will see you very soon right here on this channel. Remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. Could be a ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.